Welcome to this session about translation in organizations. My name is Jon Sundbo. I'm professor here at Cochrane University, and I was head of this research group that organizes the sessions for many years. I'm stepping in instead of Lars Fuglsang, who was prevented to come today. This session is part of a series that our research group organizes. This is the third session. Our research group is called Innovation in Service and Experiences. But today we will feature a new book by Damm Scheuer. John is associate professor here at Cochrane University and member of our research group. John has done research in organizations and particularly translation and organizational change. He has edited books, written articles and book chapters, and done a lot of empirical research. This book that we will feature today is called How Ideas Move: Themes and Models of Translation in Organizations. The book presents research on this topic and also theories about translation in organizations. And we could say as a start that translation means that processes happening more than just implementing a simple idea. So we are looking forward to become more known with this phenomenon. We have agreed that John will present half an hour, and then we will have a joint discussion. You are very welcome to send questions in the chat box, and I will chair the discussion, and John will give some answers. So please, John, step in.
Yes, thank you. As Jon said, my name is Damm Scheuer, and I wrote this book in 2021. I'm a former development consultant in healthcare, but have also been, when I got my research education, since then I've been doing research in organizational change processes. I wrote my thesis about where I used the translation perspective, and then in 2021 I kind of returned to this area of research in order to find out what had happened since I left that research area in about 2003 when I made my thesis. And the result of that process was this book that came out on Routledge in 2021. So, but I think we should get going with the presentation here. Yes, as you see, the title of the book is How Ideas Move: Theories and Models of Translation in Organizations. The reason I made the book was that actually when you look into the research literature, you can be a bit confused because it seems as though many researchers in organization studies use the word translation, but they seem to be theorizing translation processes in different ways, and there seem to be many different ways of thinking about translation processes in organizations. So I felt the need to get an overview of all these different theories and models that you find in organization studies that use the concept of translation, and the result was this book. I have other research interests. Of course, I'm very interested in translation as a perspective on organizational change. I've been studying the travel of ideas such as clinical pathways and how they are translated into practices in hospitals. I also written about the translation of corporate social responsibility in organizations. More recently, I've been looking into learning processes related to socio-technical IT development and design. And I have also written a piece, I finished the other week, where I look at accelerated knowledge translation related to solving climate problems in public-private innovation networks. Also, I have a research project. I am visiting building sites at the moment, and there I have a project where I look into the translation of security rules and knowledge about security into practice on building sites. And this project is financed by the Danish Working Environment Research Fund. Also, I have developed an interest in the communicative constitution of organizations' perspectives during the writing of my book. So, well, anyway, let's have a look at the book. As it says in the book description, this book builds on research in translation studies of change in organizations and demonstrates the implications and applications of these findings for managing innovation and change. What you get if you buy the book is an introduction to translation studies in organization studies. You get an overview of the most important theories in the area of organizational translation studies. You also, in the third part of the book, get a presentation of a model, a translation model I developed myself. I call it the idea practice translation model. And the model actually tries to theorize in more detail how our ideas materialized in local practices in organizations. So I kind of look at the situation where ideas are re-embedded, you can say, in local practices and try to zoom in on that process in this model. Also, I have a section where I discuss what the consequences of the translation perspective are for researchers and practitioners. So if you have an interest in the translation perspective on organizational change, I mean, this book might be a place to start. But let's move on. Of course, you notice that the title of the book is How Ideas Move, and a reasonable question to ask, what is an idea? And here you have a definition from the Oxford Languages Dictionary, where they define an idea as a thought or suggestion as to a possible course of action. For instance, the managing director of this university might get an idea. She might say, oh, I want Roskilde University to be a learning university. A learning organization is an organization skilled at creating, acquiring, and transferring knowledge, and at modifying its behaviors to reflect new knowledge and insights. Okay, so the director of the university might get this idea, and the way the idea is presented is in images which become known in the form of pictures or sounds. You read text about the idea of the learning organization. You perhaps see models describing what characterizes a learning organization and so forth. But also, you could say, okay, there are many ideas that are relevant for companies and public organizations. On the left side here, in red, you can see some of the ideas that the translation researcher Kjell Arne Røvik from Norway identified in 1998. So in that period of time, you had ideas like, related to formal organizational structure. You had ideas circulating among companies related to good organizational culture, good management, and well, many of the headlines here. Many of these ideas already. On the right side, we can see some of the more recent ideas that has started circulating in the environment of companies. We have, the idea of green transition, the idea of regenerative leadership, the management concept of corporate social responsibility. People are talking about agile organizing, blockchain, the use of artificial intelligence and things like that. So in the, you have a lot of ideas about how to organize and manage companies circulating among and between companies today. So, you can ask, okay, who might be interested in the book that I have written? Well, of course, as I mentioned, researchers interested in organizational translation studies might be interested in getting an overview and say, okay, what are all these theories about translation processes in organizations about? And they can read my book, right? But another, you could say, a customer in relation to the book might be a top manager in a company. Here we have a top manager. He has perhaps read the Harvard Business Review magazine, and he encounters a list of the top 10 business ideas for 2022, and he says, well, one of these ideas actually sounds like one we can use in my company, and then he wants, of course, to implement the idea. Or perhaps he goes away on a seminar with his middle managers and he comes up with a new strategy filled up with ideas about how to reorganize and make the company competitive again. So he wants to, now when he returns to the company, to kind of translate or implement these ideas. It might also be a manager of a department in a hospital, for instance, in a clinical surgery department. He's reading about some new evidence that has come out from Cochrane. They have made a new evidence-based reference program about how to operate knee patients, and he wants to introduce some of these ideas presented in this evidence-based reference program into the practices among the doctors in his clinic. Or it might be just a middle manager or an employee who himself or herself has an idea that they want to implement. So this is the kind of situation where you might be interested in also theories or research-based knowledge that can actually help you with implementing your ideas. And of course, what you do as a practitioner is that you look into the research literature. And when you do that, you see all these different types of research that somehow deals with the problem you're interested in. You see implementation science in healthcare. You see policy implementation research in public administration research, and in strategy, the strategy literature, you see strategy implementation research. And of course, you have a huge tradition for doing research in organizational change management, and these researchers even have their own magazines. And actually, also, perhaps you will hear about people working with, for instance, design thinking and ideas like that in relation to organizational change. And then suddenly you say, oh, there's someone talking about translation processes. What might that be? Well, actually, it turns out that in healthcare, in implementation science, there's a lot of researchers talking about knowledge translation, right? So you have strategy researchers who also talk about strategy translation. You have people working with policy processes who start talking about policy translation. And then, so you have a lot of different researchers in translation studies who use the concept of translation in many different areas. And then suddenly you notice my book, right? And you see, so there's a book here. It gives a kind of overview of all these researchers who try to use this concept of translation as an alternative to all the other ways you could think about implementation processes in companies. And then you get curious and start, perhaps, you acquire the book, right? And then, of course, the questions arises, what is translation? And here you can see the definition from the Bruno Latour. He's a researcher from actor network theory. And he suggests, he says this about when he tries to define what translation is. He says that according to the model of translation, the spread in time and space of anything, claims, orders, artifacts, goods, is in the hands of people. Each of these people may act in many different ways, letting the token drop or modifying it or deflecting it, or betraying it, or adding to it, or appropriating it. Wow, that was a heavy definition. Okay, but what does this actually mean? Well, if you have you can see the picture on the right. That is some children in the kindergarten, and we know this game from when we were children. You sit in a circle of kids, and you tell a story. The teacher perhaps tell a story to one of the kids, and the kids start telling the kid beside him or her the story. And what happens, of course, is that when the kids have told the story and the story come out of this circle, the story has changed. Well, you could also say that the story has been translated, right? The meaning of the story changes, perhaps. The story moves geographically from one kid to the other. Well, perhaps the story started out as a story about a hen house, 4 or 5 chickens in a hen house. But the story, when it comes back from this translation process, has become a story about 10 chickens in a hen house. And what happened on the way there? Well, perhaps there was something in the story about a fox entering the hen house and eating some of the chickens, right? And there was a boy who has chickens at home because he's a farm boy. And he didn't like that part of the story. So he changed it on the way and instead made the chickens multiply, right? So he had a political interest in the story that moved through this circle of translators. So what came out was not the story about 4 chickens being killed by a fox and reduced to only 2 chickens. It was now a story about 10 chickens. And of course we always laugh. We see when this happens in a circle of children in school. But actually, what if this also happens when, for instance, strategy ideas move between people and between groups of people? What if this happens when ideas which are about how to treat patients are derived from reference program in healthcare organizations? What if all these translations happens when all these ideas or policy ideas perhaps are translated? Let's focus upon an example here. This sounds a bit weird perhaps. Here we have the idea lean. The lean is an idea that focuses upon making processes more, you could say, well organized in companies. Here we have a definition. Lean is about the systematic removal of waste by all members of the organization from all areas of the value stream. Okay, so the idea is to take out, if we use too many resources, physical resources, if we use too many employees in delivering a service, for instance, in a hospital, in a healthcare department, then you have to get rid of that. And also, it's very typical for a concept like this. We have 5 steps you need to go through in order to realize the idea, right? This is the stuff that consultants sell to, for instance, hospitals. They come and say, oh, if you do this, if you introduce lean, you will have a 35% 35% better processes than you have now, and you will save a lot of, resources, right? Well, okay. But of course, it might be a hospital director in a hospital. He goes to a conference and hear about lean. He will meet lean as some ideas presented in lectures or presentations at the conference. Then he will tell his planning and development director to find a book about lean. It sounds like a good idea, and that person, the planning and development director, he will read the book and he write up perhaps a description of how lean might be practiced or be introduced in his hospital. And then, so of course, these abstract ideas that you find about lean, for instance, you need to translate them into new meanings locally in your hospital, into new objects, into new actions in order to implement this idea. And then we have, the problems arises. Because actually, according to translation, the translation perspective, it is always the receiver who translates and decides what an idea become locally. They can accept the ideas and tools of lean, or they might drop this idea or modify it or deflect it as it moves down, through the translation chain in the hospital. So what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn that implementation unfolds along a translation chain, and if this translation chain is broken, the implementation of the concept of lean will stop in the hospital. Nothing will happen if no one does anything in relation to the concept of lean. And also we will learn that in order for ideas to become powerful in organizations, you need to mobilize and make a lot of people translate the idea, okay? You need to have a lot of people doing a lot of work, inspired by the idea of lean in order for it to be implemented. So in translation studies, we have, it turns out when you analyze the literature, I did a huge literature review of the research and compared it to other researchers' literature reviews, and I kind of, made an overview of the different theories in organizational translation studies. So I'm going to present some of these ideas about how, or these theories and models that describes how the translation of ideas unfold in organizations. So we can start out with the first one. In neo-institutional theory, they would say that, okay, if you're a managing director of a hospital and you attend a conference and you hear about the idea of lean and you bring it home, you're actually not acting necessarily as a rational person, right? You might be influenced by, you could say, fashion waves in the organizational fields of which you are a part. Perhaps in the healthcare, in the field of the healthcare field in Denmark, perhaps at a certain period of time, the attention of administrators and managers start moving in the direction of lean as a way of improving processes. So, and you come out as a hospital director and start hearing about these new fashionable ideas, and you kind of adopt them and bring them home. Perhaps not because you're a rational actor, but because you are socially embedded in the organizational field. So, and then actually what the idea model, which is the model on the top, tries to explain, is how idea move in between organizations in organizational fields, and how ideas are moved into practice in organizations. Okay, so Barbara Chernyavska, she suggests that ideas are moved. So we have this idea of lean. It will be translated into an object, as the one I described with the planning and development manager, and then that object will be translated into actions, which, if they are repeated, will become institutionalized in the hospital. So, but of course, we have other researchers looking at translation processes in other ways. For instance, we have the Danish strategy researcher Søren Madsen, and he's looking at strategy text. And he says, well, sometimes when you translate strategy text in companies, you do it like when you translate a book from one language to the other. And when you translate a book from one language to the other, you can choose to be loyal to the meaning and words, try to reproduce the words and meanings exactly when you translate the book. You can also think about the function of the text. If you want to scare the reader by having a scene where you serve dog for dinner, then if you are in a culture where you normally eat dogs or dog meat, then it will not be very scary and you will have to find something else to present in that scene. You might also have to think about, when you translate the book, what the interest of the author was, and what are your interests as a translator of the book, right? So this way of thinking inspires new types of questions, and Søren Madsen is asking, what if you think like this when you look at how managers in companies translate strategy texts, right? Can this help us understand what goes on? Yeah, some researchers look at translation as language games. They are inspired by Wittgenstein, and actually it's Stuart Clegg. He says when consultants enters companies, for instance, to introduce lean as a concept, they kind of change things by assuring that a third kind of language is created, right? Perhaps a doctor normally would talk about clinical pathways when he tried to make his processes better, but now suddenly the introduction of another kind of other types of words and languages related to lean will kind of change his way of talking about his own way of organizing things. In the model below, we have some researchers who are inspired by symbolic interactionism. You can say, they say, okay, if we have two groups of people, a group A and a group B, their culture will be different, their languages might be different. And if that is the case, you cannot just transfer knowledge about, for instance, lean. If I'm a business administration guy from the hospital administration, I come from another culture than the doctors do. So when I introduce lean, which is a business concept, I will have to I cannot just transfer it. I have to translate the concept and actually negotiate what the concept should mean in the meeting with the doctors, right? Okay. Actually, there are some researchers in translation studies who suggest that also not just humans, but also things and objects do work. These researchers belong to actor network theory. So, for instance, if you want to construct a telemonitoring system where you monitor the blood sugar levels of diabetes patients, you need to involve both humans and objects in order to build such a system. You need to have sensors on the bodies of the patients. You need to have these sensors communicate with the mobile phone of the patients, and this mobile phone needs to send the data to the hospital, to a computer where you have some kind of software systems that monitor the blood sugar levels of the patient. And also you need to have some doctors monitoring, and perhaps if the doctor find out that your blood sugar levels are too low, he will call up you as a patient at home and say, hey, you need to take your pill, or take a needle in order to bring down the blood sugar levels. So actually you have to build a socio-technical system where humans and physical objects do work in order to realize your idea of a telemonitoring system, right? The last model I will mention here before we finish is the idea practice translation model I have developed. Here I say that translating innovative ideas is about situated communication, learning, and socio-technical co-construction in the meeting between humans and their environments. So like in actor network theory, people interact with humans and things when they want to, for instance, construct the telemonitoring systems. But what is going on, the most important processes is supposed to go on in communication processes, in dialogues, where you kind of try to find out, okay, which people and physical objects in my environment are necessary to do things in order for me to construct the telemonitoring system. But also the model brings in the experiences of people, right? I suggest that actions might arrive from people's experiences that might influence this translation of the idea about a telemonitoring system. You know, it's like the IT guy. You have a problem with the computer, and it seems to be a mystery for you what goes on with the computer, and you call the IT guy, and he comes down and he says some strange technical things, and he referred to actions, things that do something in the computer, and that explains what went wrong with the computer. So, and this shows us the kind of importance of people's knowledge, experiences, expertise when we construct socio-technical systems. And it is actually as though the researchers in actor network theory have forgotten this, that actually having experienced persons, as participants in co-construction and co-design processes, as for instance when you try to co-construct a telemonitoring system. I mean, that is very important. Having an IT guy who can go in and fix some of the technical challenges in relation to constructing the telemonitoring system because he has relevant experiences. I mean, that's very important actually, and the actor network people actually overlooks this fact. So what kinds of questions arise in organizational translation studies? What kinds of, and how are they different from perhaps other research areas? Well, as an organizational translation researcher, you're interested in what kinds of tokens are actually moving. I mean, is it ideas? Is it knowledge? Is it rules? Also, you're interested in does characteristics of the token influence the translation process? Perhaps very complicated ideas don't travel far because they are very difficult to communicate, while very simple ideas, like for instance the idea of lean I mentioned, are quite simple and easy to communicate, and that might influence the speed with which this idea travels in organizational fields, right, and among organizations. And also, if tokens are translated, who is actually translating what, how, and for what purposes? And how should we theorize translation processes? You may suggest that all these people who use this concept of translation, they are talking about the same kind of processes, but they kind of theorize them in different ways, right? And also you can say, are translation processes in specific contexts, policy translation, translation of healthcare knowledge, translation of, ideas like lean in companies. I mean, are all these processes, are they similar or are they actually different, and should be theorized perhaps also differently? Then of course you ask questions about the direction, content, speed and outcome of the translation process. And actually Kjell Arne Røvik, the Norwegian translation researcher, he asked a very interesting question. Do translators need certain translation competences? The Confederation of or the interest organization of the Danish industries in Denmark, they have said that what you need in relation to IT companies are people who are able to translate from, practical knowledge about how you kind of solve tasks in organization and then translate that knowledge into IT systems that actually support practices in a good way. So you need these technological translators in order to become very good at constructing IT systems that actually works in practice and supports work routines in practice, right? So, and then of course we have the normative question: what approaches to translation are more effective and for whom? I just wrote a piece on how we might accelerate the translation of ideas related to sustainability in public-private innovation networks. So here you have all the areas where a translation perspective might be relevant. It might be relevant in translation of strategy, in relation to translation of concepts, in translation of knowledge in organizations, also in knowledge transfer processes between universities and companies, and in relation to innovation and design of, for instance, IT systems. And of course in relation to building sites, where you try to translate rules and knowledge into practice on these building sites. But now the time has run, and it's time for some questions. So I would give the word to Jon.
Thank you, John, for an interesting presentation. One gets the impression of this phenomenon of translation is very important for practice, and there are a lot of theories that try to understand it, but maybe it's also quite abstract theories. But maybe a discussion could illustrate and clear up some of these issues. So let's go right to the questions. Yes, there's one question here saying, is the study of translation part of studies of communication, or is it different? I mean, you have no sociological field of communication sociology, and is this here just the same, or is it different?
Oh, thank you very much for the question. I think it's a very good question and relevant question. Well, actually it turns out that the only model I include in my book related to communication studies is actually my own model, is the idea practice translation model. And in that model I'm very inspired by ventriloquism and the communicative constitution of organizations perspective as it has been developed by the Canadian professor François Corinne. So there is a clear connection there between that model, specific model, and communication studies. But then many of the other theories are not actually directly related to communication studies. I would say neo-institutional theory, translation theory, is related to sociology. And that is also the case of the symbolic interactionist perspectives. If you take some of the theories that has been developed by Søren Madsen and Kjell Arne Røvig, they're very much inspired by linguistics, right? How to translate text. And then of course, I mean, they are related to different types of theories here. I think there is one policy translation researcher who says that, well, actually, if you use the ideas of the communication researcher Fiske, he would say that the translation perspective is related to a semiotic communication model, right? Where it is actually the receiver of ideas and concepts who decides what happens with the message, right? But there is no direct connection to communication theory. Only my model actually relates more directly to modern views on how organizations are constituted through communication processes. So,
well, that's another question which is a kind of critical question about what is new in this here. It says, what are the core differences between the translation perspective on change and other views, as for instance, implementation science?
Well, yeah, also a very good question. I think that the core difference between these ways of approaching organizational change processes is that in the translation perspective, you kind of try to find out what you need when you translate ideas in the process, right? So the processes unfold, you try from inside out to find out what humans and objects are actually should be mobilized and need to do work in order to realize certain innovative ideas. While in implementation science, you kind of rely on knowledge that comes from, outside in. You rely on, frameworks. You rely on research that look into what kinds of. Can you show some evidence-based reviews of which kinds of concrete interventions will actually make it possible to translate evidence-based knowledge into practice in a clinic, for instance, in a hospital? I mean, so their views is they build on a kind of outside-in view. While the translation perspective more try to build up the knowledge you need in order to make change happen from inside the processes, inside the translation processes, right? So
okay, there's a third question that continues this issue of what is particular with translation and so forth. It says, are there situations where there's no translation but just imitation? For example, when people learn to follow a manual to use a copy machine. I mean, it's a discussion of, is translation everything?
Well, wow, that's a difficult question, I think. But, well, yeah, I think that the Norwegian translation researcher, Kjell Arne Røvik, he has been suggesting that when you translate ideas like lean, you can actually move the idea perhaps in a way where you just imitate, right? So you can introduce lean in one clinic and then you can introduce it in exactly the same way in another clinic. So you actually just copy the practices of, from one clinic to the other. And in active network theory, they will say that, well, this is actually not possible. You cannot move an idea like lean, for instance, from one context to the other without changing it, changing the concept as well as changing the people who translate the idea, right? So we have completely different views on this. But I tend to somehow agree a bit with Kjell Arne Røvik because I think, for instance, in laboratory departments in hospitals, you use some machines to produce lab tests, right? And the kind of procedures you follow when you kind of interact with the machine, they're very similar. So if you are a lab technician in one hospital, it's very easy to talk about the processes that going on in labs in other hospitals because they kind of use the same kind of machinery, right? So it's like the technology is putting limits on the variation of how you as a person might behave. So I think it shows that there will be certain situations where you're actually able to imitate practices and not just not every time you can translate, right?
But
I don't know whether
it requires that these two agents in the system are quite similar. They understand each other's language and the technical aspects.
Exactly.
Yes.
It's like Carlisle says. Yeah. He says he has this knowledge translation model where he says that if you have two groups and their languages are different and their culture is different, you cannot just transfer, but you need to translate and politically negotiate what counts as knowledge, right? But you don't need to do that if you have one lab technician using the same kind of system as you have in a lab in another hospital using the same system, right? You can just transfer, and learn because your practices are very much alike. So there you can, I think, you can imitate, perhaps develop some best practices that you can immediately imitate in the other lab department, right? So, but perhaps we have other questions.
There's a question about your series of theories. Well, it says that you talk a lot about theories that try to understand organizations and translations in them, ANT, symbolic, interactionism, and so forth. But the design is maybe different from that, at least in a popular version. So how can that be in line with all these theories? Isn't that just a practical field?
Well, yeah, I totally agree. Actually, the idea practice model I develop is related to, is presented as you could say a design model, a practical design model. And I also try to situate it in design research, actually, that model. So in design, you know, you try to work with solving real life problems. You construct systems that do not exist yet, right?
So in design models, translation is a more operational, normative phenomenon or
exactly,
concept. Yes.
Exactly.
That you should remember translation when you design.
Exactly. Actually, you know, perhaps it's because I'm a development consultant in healthcare. You know, so actually, I'm very interested in actually knowledge that helps me actually, you could say, translate ideas into practical solutions. It could be IT systems, it could be processes, services. I mean, how do you actually do that? And there the translation or the design perspective is highly relevant. And that's a huge knowledge in design thinking and design research that that will be very useful if you want to solve problems. But so you could say also this socio-technical approach and this translation approach perhaps is the first theory that actually has that kind of view on you could say translation processes, and it looks into the details of how to translate ideas into kind of performative systems in practice in organizations, right?
But maybe last question we can take is a little in line with that. That is about the practice. It asks, how can you recognize a successful translation process, and how can translator capabilities as a consequence be developed in organizations? So it's two questions. How can you recognize this phenomenon, and how can you really use it and build a capability to handle it?
Yes, oh, that's a good.
This is for practitioners.
A bit complicated question.
Well, it's for practitioner.
I've been doing a research project in an emergency department in a hospital, and what we tried to do was develop a monitor that monitored the flow of patients through the emergency departments. And the problem they had in the department was that you sometimes you had too many patients. You know, the wave of patients coming into the department was too big, and the patients ended out in beds in the aisles, right? And the patients are not allowed to be there by the fire department. So that was a problem, and the doctors needed to kind of control the flow of patients through the emergency department. What we did in the project was we tried to develop a flow monitor that made it possible for doctors to monitor the flow of patients and how many patients were actually coming in from outside. How big is the wave of patients? And then the doctor should be able to try to react in time and say, okay, now I need to get rid of some of the patients in some of the beds in the department, because we know that in an hour, 5-10 patients are coming in from somewhere, right? So and we tried to co-construct, co-design this monitor together. And now I forgot the question.
But I think our time is up, so I think we need to end here.
Oh yeah, now I just need to answer the successful translation. How do I recognize it? You recognize it when if you succeed with the design process, if you actually succeed with making a monitor that helps doctors actually monitor this flow and control it, then it's a successful outcome. I mean, and you can construct systems like that in many different ways, but and that is very important to have an eye on what kind of concrete outcomes and effects do we want to produce when you co-construct, co-design, for instance, a monitor in a health department, right? So have that very clear idea and try to experiment with what kinds of objects and human activities might help you realize that idea or that vision of a monitor, right?
Thank you very much for this presentation, and thank you to you in the audience for asking questions and seeing it. I think that we can conclude that this concept of translation is very important. Also, we have been talking about implementation very much for many years, but this adds a new aspect to that is very interesting to follow in the future, in practice and in theory. So thank you, and goodbye from us.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.